Max received his PhD in chemical engineering under the supervision of Professor Yan Ning at NUS earlier this year, and is now working alongside Professor Yan to commercialize biomass fractionation deep tech. He has experience in green catalysis research for waste to value. More specifically, his thesis focused on CO2 hydrogenation to methanol, carbon capture and utilization. And his startup journey currently focuses on sustainable and cost-effective biomass utilization, which will be the focus of this discussion. While I just read a bunch of stuff that I have no idea about, which is why I brought you here today, before we talk more about your research, perhaps let's start with a bit of your background. Tell us who you are, your journey both in science and also how you got to Singapore.
Awesome. Well, First of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I know we've been talking about this for a while, so I appreciate all the effort you put in on the research side of things and getting everything set up. So I first want to thank you. But so I'm currently 27, turning 28 next month. I was born in Encino, California, which is Southern California, near like Universal Studios area. But my family moved to Las Vegas when I was about 2 months old, so I consider myself born and raised in Las Vegas. So I grew up there until I was 18, and then went to Arizona State University for my undergraduate degree, which is only about a 4.5-hour drive from Las Vegas. It's in the it's technically Tempe, but it's like the greater Phoenix area. And one of probably the biggest things I did during my undergraduate was I did study abroad the summer after my junior year, which was 2018. And at the time, I was, I guess I should have prefaced, I studied chemical engineering at ASU, which is also what I did my PhD in. But the summer after my junior year, which is around the time you want to kind of start looking for internships, I wasn't really sure whether or not I wanted to stay in industry or pursue, the academic path potentially. So I got the opportunity to come to Singapore for 2 months during that summer. And that is how I met Prof. Yan. I was working in his group as an exchange student. And although I didn't have so much involvement with him on a day-to-day basis, I was getting mentored by one of his PhD students. So throughout the 2 months, my responsibilities basically included assisting her with experiments, preparing material, attending meetings, doing readings, things of that nature. And that's where I got my feet wet with academic research and kind of what that entails. So after that experience in 2018, I went back to complete my senior year at ASU, and I did an honors undergraduate thesis. So it wasn't the exact same field of research that I did at NUS, but I did a project for about a year on protein engineering, which furthered my experience in academic research, and I actually wrote a thesis for my undergraduate degree as well. So that gave me a lot of good experience, an understanding of what academic research is all about, what the purpose of it is, etc. And my initial plan was actually to continue my master's degree under the same supervision I had during my undergraduate degree. But almost, I guess, by fate, when I reached out to Professor Yan and Professor Rika Nazaruddin, who was my PhD mentor at the time, who is now a professor at a university in Malaysia. I say it's fate because Prof. Yan was actually visiting Rika in her new university in Malaysia where she got a job, and she was showing him something on the screen. And so my email popped across the screen while he was viewing something, and he was like, why don't I have a PhD opportunity open? Why don't you let him know about it and see if he's interested? Mm-hmm. So that's a crazy little story I always like to tell as to like how I ended up here, because it's just a crazy coincidence that brought him to see that email. So it was obviously a very tough decision. I did probably think about it for 4 to 5 months. I did a lot of research on what the academic supervisor really focuses his research on, and what facilities and kind of resources he has at his disposal as well. Since these are all things that are going to really guide and decide your journey over the next 4.5 years. So after coming to that decision, I did agree to start my PhD. Initially, it was supposed to be the middle of 2020. It got pushed back to the beginning of 2021 because of COVID. In the meantime, I worked in Las Vegas after my graduation of my undergraduate to kind of fill space for a bit. And then, came to Singapore in 2021 and have been here ever since. So, that's a bit about me. People always ask how I've ended up here, how, American guy from Vegas ends up in Singapore. But, I hope that gives some additional context on that.
Exactly, because I think Vegas is not known for its science industry or
right.
Universities, academics.
Correct.
So how did you choose to become a scientist, or did you have like an aha moment when you grew up, when you think about majors in college?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I would say falling in love with science has been something that has been very gradual for me. I guess the closest thing I would have to an aha moment was actually an internship I did. I think it was after my junior year of high school. So I was about 16 or 17. And both my mom has worked in like retail and operations her entire life, and my dad has worked in finance. So I've kind of been around that space my entire life. So actually up to that time, I was interested in business. I didn't know specifically what that meant, whether it was banking or finance or venture capitalism, et cetera. But I actually, because of this interest, got an internship at a bank when I was, again, 16 or 17. And I just hated it. It was tough. Like, the people were very nice. But it was clear to me that path wasn't going to, like, really fulfill me in any way, shape, or form. Like, even after 2 weeks, I was burnt out of, like, heading to that office because I knew I was going to be doing the same thing I did the day before. So that was my aha moment, I guess, to like really turn me towards science. I always had like better test scores in that regard. Like my math testing was pretty strong, and I always liked chemistry because, especially as we got like more towards like the organic chemistry side of things, it's very visual. Like I'm a very visual learner, so I gravitate more towards the fields of math and science that can be visually represented, especially with like good teachers in classroom settings and things like that. So to be honest, I chose my major of chemical engineering more based on my skill set. I kind of believe the sentiment that, in an ideal world, everyone would do, what their dream is or what they love the most. But I think you have to kind of leverage your expertise and your skills as well. And then what I experienced is as I put more and more hours into it, the 10,000 hour rule, and I faced challenges but overcame those challenges and then saw the rewards that came with that, I began to like fall more and more in love, for lack of a better word, with like science and more specifically like academic research. So I guess the short answer to the question would be I don't think Las Vegas had anything to do with developing my scientific, I guess, interest or acumen. It was really just at the time, like need-based. I wanted to be sure I could get a job out of college and that, what I was doing suited what I was, most effective at.
Exactly. I think you put it really well, or kind of your story illustrates that it's less about what your passion is, especially if you ask a kid who doesn't really understand the working world. It's more about just sticking to something that you are adequately good at and keep working at it. And then as you improve, as you get better, as you overcome challenges, then you find you kind of grow your love for that craft over time.
Absolutely, yeah.
So as now that you've completed your PhD and looking back to this journey, what does it mean to you to be a scientist in today's world, and kind of what motivates you to wake up every day?
So I think that question would depend specifically on like what field of science you're doing. I'll focus on like the sustainability aspect side of things because I think it's most relevant to my research and what I've done. But I think being a scientist, if I had to say one thing that always defines a good scientist, and I've really learned this from my supervisor and then also my mentors I've had as well, is curiosity. So to me, like the best scientists are incredibly curious people that are always scrutinizing or trying to poke holes into how things are done currently. From a sustainability aspect, that means, how can we make this chemical process more environmentally benign, reduce carbon emissions, things like that. I think also a scientist is a constant problem solver as well. In the green chemistry context, this means finding different avenues to utilize waste, I believe. But I want to I think if I really could sum it up in one word, curiosity and creativity really define like good scientists, because these are people that are naturally, you don't have to hand them a textbook problem to get their mind working on things. These are people that drive by on a freeway and see a chemical plant and they're just curious about what it is. I can actually tell a little bit a story about my supervisor that I think is really cool because it defines exactly what I said as to what makes a great, amazing, in his case, scientist was one of the projects he actually brought to NUS. So he grew up in China, did his undergrad and PhD at Peking University, and then spent some time in Switzerland before he came to NUS. But during that time, he was actually out at a restaurant one time. And he was eating prawns, just like so crustacean shell waste essentially is like crabs, lobster, shrimp, right? So you get a shrimp in a restaurant, you pop it open, you eat the shrimp, and you get rid of the shell. So his curiosity he saw all this shrimp waste being dumped into a trash can. And just the way his mind works is he was interested, is there anything valuable within that shell waste that's worth extracting out and turning this what's otherwise like environmental discharge, right? Because otherwise it just goes to a landfill. There's literally taxes associated with it. It's a logistical expense for these restaurants or shell food manufacturers to get rid of it. So that aspect of seeing trash and just seeing it be completely like thrown away just got his mind working, and that's how he initiated this principle and concept that he eventually brought to NUS. And was kind of his like calling card for quite some time. So I think that's just one very like niche example, but I think like that mindset of always questioning like, could this be better? Could this waste be valuable? Things like that. I think that's what it means to be a scientist.
Right, and you just kind of follow your natural curiosity and don't just think about the question, but also actually chase them, pursue them, and see if you can actually do something differently, find ways to solve the problem. I think most of us go on our days just in the auto motion. Like you don't ask about, why are things being done this way? Just because they've always been this way, right? But it's because of the effort and the innovations from scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs over time that we got to where we are today, which is kind of also in the spirit of this podcast, is exploring, asking questions that people wouldn't usually cared, and diving deeper into topics that are probably overlooked in the society today. I think you touched a little bit on your research just now on green chemistry. So perhaps now is a good segue to explore more on your professional side of things. Can you give us just a quick 101 for someone who has just a basic understanding of chemistry? What is green chemistry, or what is this area of science that you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So green chemistry, I could regurgitate some like textbook definition for you, but essentially what green chemistry is it's replacing environmentally harmful processes with those that are sustainable and, not to use the word in the definition, but like green and beneficial for the environment. So some of the KPIs for this, for example, are things like energy usage is a huge one, CO2 emissions. There's a analysis we do called the life cycle analysis, and although I'm not an expert on it, I understand the basics of it. But essentially, what it does is it can go from what's called cradle to grave, like the start of the process to the end product, sale, distribution, etc., and quite literally quantify all of these different sustainability metrics. So, like one example is in terms of the green chemistry context is you're always essentially trying to replace harmful reagents with milder, less intensive ones. So just one example of this is I'll kind of touch on my PhD thesis is the CO2 hydrogenation to methanol project. So for someone that doesn't maybe know these terms so well, like methanol is essentially it's an additive for fuel. So in a layman's sense, you can kind of equate methanol to gasoline, fuel, etc. And currently, this is produced through the burning of fossil fuels. So in order to create this methanol, you have to do a ton of there comes with it an enormous amount of environmental discharge. So this includes things like wastewater, exhaust, like raw material dumping into landfills, things like that. And all of these can be quantified in that analysis I mentioned earlier. So in my reaction, so an example of a green chemistry integrated reaction is CO2 hydrogenation to methanol. Because we're taking CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, so that means it contributes to global warming. And we're taking this otherwise harmful gas and we're capturing it. And now we're utilizing it to make a value-adding chemical, which is methanol in this case. And so you can understand with that example then, we're essentially eliminating the use of this very environmentally harmful raw material and replacing it with one that actually benefits the environment if you remove it. So I think it was mentioned in the introduction, but I think the one phrase I always kind of keep in mind from a green chemistry sense is waste to value. Like what is currently harming our environment? Again, this spans an enormous amount of avenues, right? It can be pollution, wastewater, nuclear energy in some cases. You can kind of get like your mind can go crazy, like thinking of all the different potentials. But we essentially want to take anything that's considered waste or harmful to the environment and extract value from it, not only to reduce or eliminate its, I guess, introduction to the environment, but by doing so, we're then able to replace environmentally harmful processes. So it really attacks, the kind of net carbon zero and the circular carbon economy metrics that a lot of these countries that have an emphasis on sustainability are trying to hit. It really attacks this perspective twofold, because you're not only reducing the amount of harmful discharge in the atmosphere, you're using that harmful discharge to replace the creation of more harmful discharge as well. So it's a direct reduction, but also an indirect reduction through elimination. And so that's why green catalysts, in my case, and sustainable technology is really at the forefront of what's driving a lot of investment these days, is because there's a ton of government pressure, varying on the country, but at least globally, to make these processes more sustainable. So I hope that answers the question. But again, I think the main thing, if you really want to hone on in for one phrase, is the waste to value proposition. I think if that can be kind of your like working mindset, then your processes are going to naturally become more green and efficient over time.
I see it now. I think you explained it perfectly, kind of illustrating why this is so important today, but also how this is a very efficient way, because it not only eliminates the waste, but also it contributes to a better way of producing the same chemicals that we require. We're not
absolutely
trying to reduce the amount of energy need or consumption or utilization. We're just finding alternative ways to satisfy those needs.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think the natural question following that would be why it hasn't been done this way for all this long time of human, I guess, the history of science.
Right.
And what were the bottlenecks? What were the challenges? Is this were they at the innovation part was like if you think about it, like in the chemistry labs, or was it more in the real world in terms of commercialization, mass production, scaling, or is it the government on the regulation side? Why it hasn't been done this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are many factors that contribute to it, and I'll kind of just touch on some of them. So in the initial stages, it was quite literally a scientific question. Was the know-how wasn't published or, well established enough to replace these environmentally harmful processes. I found we actually had ETH, so ETH Zurich, one of the top universities in Switzerland. They actually have a joint workshop with the Center of Hydrogen Innovations at NUS. And there was a really interesting discussion there because it was a lot of the top experts in science kind of presenting their ideas. And what I found to be very interesting was we're actually to a point now where the technology is completely developed. Even, for example, I'll use CO2 as kind of like the use case for this conversation, just to keep it consistent. But again, I mentioned CO2 as a greenhouse gas, so this is a direct, bad guy, for lack of a better word, for global warming. So now the technology is actually in place now to where not only can we capture CO2 efficiently, so any process that emits CO2, you can have like these membrane, you can kind of think of them as like filters in a layman's sense to just capture the CO2 and prevent it from entering the atmosphere. But in terms of the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, there's actually technology in place for that as well to basically suction it up, is essentially what it is, and directly then reduce our CO2 emissions, right? Because right now the graph you see, like greenhouse gas emissions, it's straight line up. But we actually have the technology in place now to start reversing the curve. But it's a matter of two things at this point now that the science is developed. It's cost, and it's what goes hand in hand with cost is government regulation in a global aspect, and I'll kind of touch on each one. So in terms of cost, a lot of times you have this green chemistry principle, right? And you get into the lab and you're able to find a new green reagent for something that's able to produce your target product. However, the cost of that reagent and maybe the complexity needed to develop it on a large scale is not cost effective from a techno-economic analysis. So it's going to be basically, if you want to use your harsh reagents, which are your things like sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, sodium hydroxide, these are like bulk, enormous. You get them in like megaton containers, and they're basically inexpensive, like almost essentially like free, like near the cost of water because of how streamlined the processes for production are. And so it's very difficult to motivate these large chemical companies that have been in place and operating in a profitable kind of model for so long to now have this enormous cost increase because a lot of green reagents are inherently more expensive due to some of the complexities that you have to integrate in order to leverage upon like the chemistry for it. So where it really gets interesting is when a process is more greener and more sustainable, but also more cost effective, which is what we're doing for our startup, is because we understand simply saying a process is greener isn't going to be good enough in most cases. There are some companies like in Saudi Arabia, these places with endless amounts of money that are willing to pay double the price for, again, being consistent with methanol, for example, to say we have green methanol. But that's just because like they have endless money and basically their cost of goods it's a rounding error for them. Yeah. So in a lot of cases where like, these COOs and these finance people are looking at every line item, it can be difficult at times to justify the use of green chemistry when the cost increase is so significant. Another thing I touched on too is it's kind of like the elephant in the room is each country has a different level of emphasis on green technology and sustainability as a whole. So for example, some companies like Iceland, they give you enormous tax credits and like carbon credits if you use sustainable technology. So they make like the cost of electricity much cheaper, for example, if you're using your electricity for a sustainable process. So Iceland is a great place to be an entrepreneur in the green technology side of things, because they quite literally financially incentivize you to do it. That's not the case with every country, and every country is different as well. And I say that in terms of like a global implementation of technology standpoint is, if the technology in some cases is more expensive to implement, then countries are going to be at different capacities to be able to afford it. Kind of, you can understand it becomes like almost a luxury in that sense, right? Like if a country is, very well off, has high GDP, et cetera, and can afford to, bring the hammer down on some of these companies that don't use sustainable technology to motivate them to do so, then it's more like it's a luxury in that context, where like, developing countries that struggle in that regard, they need their they need the companies based in their country to be able to, operate functionally and in a profitable manner and keep people employed and things like that. So it not only becomes a question of emphasis, but also resources available to do so. And, there's like some conflict going on in the Middle East and Russia and the Ukraine. And you can imagine then like the level of priority for these people that are quite literally at war for green and sustainable technology is not so high. Like they're worried about today and tomorrow and like a week from now, not 25 to 30 years down the road, or even more in some cases. So it's a question that we could probably like talk about for an hour just on that topic alone. But those are some of like the high level things that I've found to be really interesting, especially once I learned more about the technology and was convinced that the technology is actually in place. It's just a matter of countries not choosing to integrate it for a variety of reasons. So I hope that kind of answers the question. Again, there's more I can get into, but
yeah, absolutely. So if I can just post a statement to you, and then you tell me your thoughts whether it's true or false. I think the belief is green technologies are inherently more expensive than the current way of doing things, than traditional, fossil fuel production, or whether it's in the chemistry industries. What do you think of that?
So I think in terms of like actual dollars, is we don't like, I would punt on that question for a while because we don't know yet. I will say it is absolutely more expensive from an intellectual capital standpoint. Basically, like, because again, there could be some solution that nobody has found yet that makes green and sustainable technology actually more affordable than the fossil fuel derived routes. And it would depend like on each field too. There are a lot of, very encouraging cases where it's not more expensive than fossil fuel derived route. But for these giant processes like methanol production, for example, there are people like working towards it. And when you contextualize kind of like how recently we've begun this emphasis on green chemistry versus where we're at, and you contextualize that versus the development of fossil fuels and that time, because people have to understand like things like the Haber-Bosch process, for example, or some of these processes that are like very fossil fuel intensive, but now very streamlined and optimized. Like this wasn't the case centuries ago. Yeah. And even those processes took decades and centuries of work to develop and get to the point they are now. And so when you look at like the development of science from a green tech standpoint in relation to that, I think we're on a good pace actually. Like it's just that we haven't, we started the race like a bit later, whereas like these other like processes, they've had, again, decades and centuries of development. And so I do think like it's progressing quite encouragingly. Yeah. But it does require, like I said, a large amount of intellectual capital. So that literally means like brain power, whether it's professors or these joint programs or whatever it is like people have to like quite literally like solve these problems. And that's where, because of kind of the head start that the other processes got, where it's more expensive, for lack of a better term, is in terms of like, again, the intellectual capital.
Right. That's what I had in mind too, that characterization of the traditional industries had centuries or decades of head start. Right. So it's unfair to compare them versus the stage of green technologies today.
Absolutely. Like what was probably deemed impossible to them at the time has now been shown possible. So a lot of these green processes where people are arguing, oh, it's impossible to make it more affordable than a fossil fuel derived route. Just give it some time.
Yeah. Can you perhaps give us some examples of what are the most promising technologies, whether ones you're working on, related to what you're working on, or just the ones that have been massively adopted today?
I'll talk specifically about the one will have worked on because it's considered like one of the like big giants is the methanol production. So you can imagine, I think methanol, it's produced $55 trillion per year annually.
Methanol is a fossil fuel?
It's basically like a fuel additive.
Okay.
So it's like a main component in like gasoline.
So in the burning process, it releases greenhouse gas?
Yes, it can. In the production of methanol, it
Okay.
produces a large amount of greenhouse gas. So this is one of those like technical giants that like people have a lot of interest in.
Okay.
I think it's progressing like quite nicely. One thing that is really important, I don't want to like get too off topic, but it goes back to your earlier question, is a lot of times what you can prove to be in your earlier question about why more green technology hasn't been adopted yet is what can be proven in the lab oftentimes is very difficult to prove on a larger and larger and larger scale too. So CO2 to methanol, it's been proven on the lab scale pretty well, and now people are more so focused on the operational side of things. I think one thing that will be really, really important that is progressing incredibly nicely is the cost of green hydrogen. Because green hydrogen, for example, it makes up 80% of the cost for green methanol. So in the CO2 to methanol process, 80% of your cost is coming from the cost of green hydrogen.
If you lower the cost of that, it will dramatically, it's like a game changer.
Exactly. It's like what we call in science like a rate limiting step. It's basically like your hold up, for lack of a better term. But I think, green hydrogen is a huge one because that's going to be able to affect so many different reactions. And these pathways and processes that were otherwise deemed non-feasible from an economic standpoint are going to become a lot more cost-effective once that green hydrogen costs come down. So I'm not a specific expert in the technology for that field specifically. I'm more focused on what we do with the hydrogen once we get it. But that's actually an issue we faced with a lot of our projects when we pitch to investors and things like that is we're too reliant on the cost of green hydrogen. Yeah. And we're not the only ones. So And again, there's a lot of great technology. People understand the emphasis. There's a lot of, even within Singapore, there's been a lot of government push toward developing green hydrogen technologies. So I think it's progressing nicely. I think the target is by the year 2030, it should be relatively affordable for these industrial processes. So that would be the big one. And that I've like experienced or I've guess like felt the pain of most harshly in my research.
Yeah. So if we take a step back here, and we can go back to CO2 to methanol later, just to understand kind of the landscape of the opportunity we're addressing here, the total addressable market. There is CO2 to methanol. What are some other processes that people are working on that are trying to commercialize in the green chemistry field? What are some other, I guess, reactions, if you can put in this terms of input, output, or
so we probably focus on maybe 7 to 8 different reactions in our research group. So one of them being CO2 to methanol. Another huge one, and this relates to what I'm working on now, is biomass, what we call biomass valorization or utilization. And so biomass is essentially just like any waste from nature. So it can be tree trunks, for example, or shell waste in our case, or plastics is biomass. So you can think of biomass utilization as kind of your typical recycling mindset, where you want to take waste plastics, waste discharge, waste from animals, and utilize it to value-adding products. A lot of these products are in like the pharmaceutical and cosmetic sectors. Another thing we focus on, and this is another big one, as well as ammonia cracking. So again, I'm not an expert on this specific reaction, but essentially what ammonia cracking is, it's an avenue for increased green and sustainable hydrogen storage. And it's a very like kind of fundamental concept to understand, but that's another huge one that we work on. Methane conversion as well. So methane is just another gas, another greenhouse gas that we focus on. I'm trying to think. And nitrogen activation is another one too. And of course, like this is just within our group, but the lithium-ion batteries, and we also focus on electrocatalysis, which is huge for like EVs, for example, or fuel cells and things like that. So, and then our group, our neighbors next door, so the professor next door, he focuses on membrane technology. So he's essentially, I mentioned, we use the CO2 and we use the hydrogen. He's the one that focuses on capturing it to reduce it from entering the atmosphere with like these very unique membrane systems. So you can kind of think of it as like he captures it, then we use it and create something else. So yeah, those are just some of the ones we do, but really the list of reactions is endless, but we try to focus on the big ones. So again, that's CO2 hydrogenation, biomass conversion, absolutely ammonia cracking, and like methane conversion and nitrogen activation as well.
Got it. And the one you're working on right now is the CO2 hydrogenation, or that's one you.
So that was what my
before.
My thesis was on, and now I'm doing biomass fractionation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perhaps now tell us a bit more on your current project, and kind of to the extent that you can share. What's your role in it, and kind of what's its impact, and what can people look forward to as an average person on the street eating their prawns in the prawn noodles.
So the project I discussed earlier that my supervisor brought to NUS with his inspiration being, seeing the shrimp shells get thrown away. It's a shrimp shell utilization project, and we call it the shellfish biorefinery. And so basically what it is we focus on three main sources of crustacean shells. So that's crab, shrimp, and lobster. And each of these three types of shells contains a very valuable chemical in it. I guess I can say the chemical. It's chitin. So Chitin. You can pronounce it chitin or chitin. But this, and I won't get too much into the like organic chemistry nitty-gritty side of things, but it essentially has a very applicable functional group that can be used for a wide variety of industries. So I believe the numbers kind of vary depending on what assumptions you used, but the market size for chitin currently is around 8 billion SGD and growing quite rapidly at like a CAGR of 13%. So this chemical within the shell waste is insanely valuable. And so essentially what our technology does is we extract this very valuable chemical from this shell waste. Well, I guess I should add some context first. So right now we've proven a lot of the technology on a lab scale standpoint. And I am the first person within the group to show interest in commercializing this idea. So what I do now currently is I'm roughly defined as like the COO, as this potential startup. My supervisor being the principal investigator, and we have two other team members, one on business and one on tech. So we're working towards commercializing this technology. So that includes all the different things that go into it, scaling it up, finding strategic partners, customers. We have a program through NUS called GRIP. It stands for the Graduate Research Investment Program, that is specializing at helping deep tech startups, giving us the info we need, the connections we need, et cetera. So that's what I'll be beginning full time in July.
So I guess before we delve deeper, like you mentioned this chemical, insanely valuable chemistry gold, chitin or chitin.
Yep.
Tell us like what it is, like how is it currently being used, and why is there such a big opportunity area? Kind of what does it go into, perhaps?
So it's that's a great question. There are a lot of companies use it currently for. It has so many different applications, but The higher margin utilizations for it are cosmetics and pharmaceuticals. So in terms of like what it is, it's a specific like nitrogen functional group. If people like want to get into the science side of things, but higher margin markets are pharmaceuticals and cosmetics. In terms of like pharmaceuticals, it's used quite often for wound healing. So it's an additive for bandage that help wounds heal, help burn wounds heal, things like that. Cosmetics, I think it's your basic kind of like makeup palette variety of products. A lot of people, and this is something we're considering as we're industrializing it, is it's also quite applicable for wastewater treatment and agriculture. And these markets are particularly interesting because they have lower barriers of entry. So you can kind of enter these markets a bit more easily.
Yeah.
Another thing that we're also exploring as well is within our group, we don't only focus on the extraction of this chemical chitin, but also the conversion of it as well. So I mentioned it's very valuable because a lot of companies, like I'm just making up one, but Wilmar, for example, or like DuPont or Shell, like they'll take chitin and they'll then convert it into something that's even higher value adding.
Yeah.
So we also have a lot of really great technology from our group for this as well, for chitin to a wide variety of different products. So we're exploring that as well, whether or not we want to sell this chitin or if we want to take it and
value
convert
add.
it. Yeah, value add, whether or not the additional infrastructure, reagents, et cetera, is worth the cost of selling it a bit extra.
Where do these companies currently get chitin from?
So there are other companies that do chitin extraction from shell waste. Like we're not the first people to come up with this idea, but we're the first ones to do it sustainably. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, it's not just a sustainability play; it's also cheaper.
Yeah.
So your question, where there's the largest manufacturer in Asia is from China.
Yeah. Does it only come from shell waste?
Chitin? No. So there are like.
So the chitins currently exist in the existing products in the industries, in cosmetic industry, pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, so they use like typical like organic chemistry precursors and things like that for it. So rather than like extract the chitin from shell waste or like anything that has it in the first place, you can quite literally like synthesize it.
Got it. So they don't get it as ready-made chemical input, but they use the chemical.
It would depend. I mean, some
process.
people, like people that focus on chitin conversion, like they're just getting it ready-made.
Okay.
But then there's some company out there that is making it in the lab and then supplying them with it, I mean.
Oh, and the process of extracting it is more efficient, is more cost-effective, I presume.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Just going back to what he said, do you work with these companies currently? The list of companies you mentioned, like Wilmar, Shell?
Not yet, but we're going to start making calls very soon.
Okay.
Yeah, there's like some things we have to. I know we talked about it off camera, but what's very interesting is that this is like a process-oriented technology, meaning that like the chitin we sell, like although it is higher quality than others, you can't like distinguish chitin as like a patented product, right?
It's commodity.
So it's more so like the process is patented, and although you can patent a process, it's very difficult to enforce. So these are things we have to kind of keep in mind when we look for strategic partners. We want to look at partners maybe like a few, like 2 to 3 stages like down the supply chain, so that they're not so close to like the chitin extraction technology. But yeah, we're there's a lot of different ways we could go, and that's kind of like some cost-benefit analyses we're doing. But I think the most important step will be like customer outreach at this stage, because we really want to understand, how are people purchasing chitin typically? Like, do they want this purity? Do they want this grade of it? In the case of our conversion potentials, are these products people are interested in, or are they purchased in such low quantities that you couldn't justify the cost? So these are kind of some of the things we're looking at now. But
I guess imagine like we're in the chemistry lab of your research group and trying to solve this problem. Where do you get the I guess, the shells from the crabs, and then
right now, fair price. I swear, you can get them at fair price.
And once you, go through the chemistry process, which I won't delve into, it's consider your patent processes, and at the other end, this chitin product. How, if I want to imagine the chitin, what does it look like? Is this like in the liquid form, in the gas?
That's a good question. So yeah, the chitin itself. I'll kind of touch on the raw material question first, because I mentioned, like, from a lab scale, we do get our chitin, or our shell waste from fair price.
Yeah. But
that's also one of the huge benefits of doing this type of technology in Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia is the #1 generator of shell waste. So the three countries that generate the most are India, Thailand, and Vietnam. And so we're going to be, like, on the larger scale, that's where we're going to be getting our shell waste from. We're going to be making, like, we'll find, the suppliers in India, Vietnam, Thailand, all other places in Southeast Asia as well. And that really helps us a lot because it de-risks our supply chain. Whereas you can imagine if you're relying on one country and their regulations for it, then something can go bad if something changes in that one specific country. In terms of, like, what the actual product looks like, it's a powder chitin. Yeah. But there are ways to liquefy it, and actually, if you liquefy it, the value becomes a bit higher because the people that want to use the chitin prefer it in a liquid form. So that's also something we're exploring. When I mentioned the chitin conversion, we also kind of group liquefaction into that as well. So that's a question that will depend on our market research. Are people willing to purchase it in the powder form, or do they want it in the liquid form? And how does this kind of change our business model?
So I guess you're trying to enter this market by positioning yourself as a more superior product. I'm just trying to think in the head of a commercialization officer or CEO, and currently your clients purchase chitin in one way or another from other supply chain alternatives, right? And you're trying to knock them out of their production process, of their procurement process. Or are you trying to replace some other chemicals that are not chitin or chitin related?
I think right now we're focusing on chitin specifically.
Okay.
You mentioned kind of what we call, like, technological differentiators. That's basically what we do better than other people.
Yeah.
So our chitin is higher purity because, like, our green and sustainable reagents, they don't destroy the chitin as much as some of these harsher reagents. And also because of the efficiency of our process, our minimum selling price is roughly half of the traditional processes. So we can sell a higher product at a lower cost compared to our competitor. That's kind of our technological differentiator.
And plus you have a greener process, sustainability side.
Exactly.
Do you have a rough measure of the impact if everyone were to convert their chitin procurement from biomass rather than the chemistry reaction?
Yeah, we have the numbers, yeah.
Like how much, like, is it like in the
like,
quantity of CO2 reduction or
energy usage, et cetera? Yeah, it's orders of magnitude less.
I think that would be huge, because the companies then can talk about their what they're working on in the green sustainability aspect. It's been a huge issue with whether from the board or the external stakeholders.
I think another thing that, because we talk about sustainability, like, there's the research side of things, which I kind of touched on earlier, but there are actually huge benefits if you can find a good process from the commercial side of things as well.
Yeah.
And I'll just kind of give you an example is, because our process is more green and sustainable, basically, like, the shell waste contains 4 components. So if you're getting, like, raw shell waste, it contains the chitin, a little bit of water, so you just have to dry it out, and then proteins and calcium carbonate. So essentially the process is these other companies, they remove the protein and then they remove the calcium carbonate. But because they use these very harsh reagents, the protein that they remove and the calcium carbonate that they remove are very diluted with hazardous chemicals, meaning that you can't utilize these other products. So they're only I guess, end product is like their extracted chitin. Whereas like if you do this process more sustainably, then you open the door up to these other precursors that you're removing. Again, it goes into my idea of waste to value, right? In their case, their waste is literally the calcium carbonate and the proteins because they have to remove these to extract their chitin. But we can actually use this waste as something valuable because the technology we're using is like, it still preserves that as well.
It doesn't contaminate the byproducts.
Exactly. And so because of this, we can make literally every step in the process a profit generator. And this is incredibly valuable to investors, not because they just want to say, oh, you're green, you're sustainable, like we're so happy. It's because you're de-risking your entire like business plan and model. If you're not completely reliant on solely the sale of chitin and you still are calcium carbonate, for example, it's used in like low carbon cement or proteins. Like you can literally sell it to like farms because like animal
feed.
Exactly. These are all things that like will get investors really happy. And so that's something I'm glad like we came to this point because not only does this waste to value proposition, it doesn't only just benefit the environment as well. But if you can kind of think about this and make what we call like our process design, which is like quite literally like how you design like a power plant, for example. You usually do it on like simulation first and then like build it out small scale and then large scale. But if you can integrate that waste to value mindset into your supply chain and your process design, then you're going to find ways to create value-adding products that otherwise weren't there. And so investors get pretty excited about that as well.
And
that has nothing to do with just pure like sustainability, right? This is now it's like now
we're talking
quite
business.
literally because like now you're really incentivizing them. Like now you're tapping into like their bottom line. And how you can improve it potentially, and that's what really interests them more so than a green chemistry context.
So in that example you mentioned, the bad guy is the reagent. That's kind of the part of the reaction process that introduce the harmful inputs or the chemical elements.
And induces high cost too, because anytime you're using like a harsh reagent, your equipment has to be much more corrosion resistant for it.
Okay.
So your reactor costs, they're going to go much higher. Your reactor maintenance is going to go much higher. They're going to depreciate much further. These are all things that we integrate into what we call like techno-economic analyses. So we quite literally map up like every single step of the process and do the math and just like understand what it's going to cost and what we're getting out of it.
What are reagents, and how do you replace them in your process, I guess, to make it more sustainable?
So a reagent is basically just anything that like drives a reaction.
Okay. So is it the same term, catalyst? Do they say the same thing, or
you can kind of use them like yes and no. Like I think of like a catalyst as anything that improves the reaction.
Okay.
But it kind of depends like how you want to. Some people call reagents catalysts because it is like technically driving the reaction.
Okay.
A lot of times people will add catalysts to reagents. That's kind of like the most like straightforward way of understanding it.
Okay.
There's also different fields of catalysts too. There's like homogeneous catalysis, whereas basically like you're adding a water catalyst to a water reagent, like homo as in like keeping it the same, and then CO2 hydrogenation, for example, is like a heterogeneous catalysis system because my catalyst is like a solid material, but the reaction is gas phase. So it depends, like the how you want to like manipulate the definition depends a bit on like the specific reaction, but you can kind of think of it as that way, as like the reagent, aka we can roughly define it as the catalyst, like drives the reaction. So again, and in this case, the reaction is the removal of proteins or the removal of the calcium carbonate. So you want to like essentially engineer a reaction that does that efficiently.
I see.
And in the past, the reagent is very harsh things. So it's basically like we're changing what you dump the shrimp shell waste into.
Got it.
Yeah.
And are these reagents like, I guess there are also people who make a living out of producing these harmful reagents.
Yeah, that's what I was mentioning earlier. Is like these the harmful reagents are actually incredibly standardized because from a chemistry standpoint, it's like very straightforward. Like you use a very strong acid, it's easy to remove calcium carbonate. So like chemistry wise, it's not that complicated. But Yeah, these are like what we call like commodity chemicals. Something like hydrochloric acid, for example, is like incredibly standardized and very cheap. And so they have so many revenue sources for it. Like if it gets cut out of one process, like there's always going to be a need for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, but those are like the big giants kind of take care of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I presume they're also more than happy or open to integrating other, if it's commercially sensible, right? Mm-hmm. Integrating other production or reaction processes to their business model as well. So if you think about like the next steps of commercializing the technology, and you mentioned like knocking on doors, making cold calls to these companies, what do you anticipate them to ask you, or in both their due diligence process, or ask you to improve, work on?
So the number one thing we need to do now, the technology is pretty ironclad. Like we've already been awarded for it like a decent amount, and we've received over $1 million in funding for it already. But what we need to do from a tech standpoint is we need to scale it up. Because right now we basically, the most we've done is 25 grams of shell waste, which is big for a lab sense, but we're talking like kilotons is what we're going to eventually need to get to. And it's very interesting, it's like Murphy's Law. You would think like we want to run this bigger, like let's just get a bigger reaction, a bigger reactor, add more reagents, add more shell waste, and the number should all stay the same, but it never works like that. You have to scale it like very gradually, and there's going to be mass transport or heat transport or thermodynamic issues that come, to the surface when you try to increase the scale of it. And so that's what we are diving into a lot on the technical side of things, is we need to now scale it up, because again, we have shown the clear benefit on the lab scale. So if we can replicate these numbers on a much larger scale, it's pretty inarguable. But until we do that, that's what people are going to want to see. So I would say like the scale up is really like, again, to use the term rate limiting step, that's what we need to do. And we want to have a strategic part. But the one thing to consider too is this is incredibly like capital intensive, right? You can imagine building like a power plant is going to take tens, if not hundreds of $1 million of capital. And so that's something we're looking at as well with our strategic partners, is somebody that has that infrastructure in place already, to where we can use their large-scale reactors, kind of iron out some of these issues that we anticipate finding. And then once we have those protocols in place, and that's another way to inherently protect your technology, even if the patent's not so enforceable, is we know that there's going to be a lot of know-how needed at these different scale-up stages. And so even if they understand what we're doing on a very small scale, that's not going to help them that much when it comes time to scale up. So that's another way to protect the patent. But
the power plant part is because you need the electricity, or it's you just need the space and the equipment?
You need the space, but mostly the equipment and the distribution center. What was I going to say? It's very, it's, one thing people don't like, thing investors hate to hear is licensing.
Yeah.
Because you can imagine like we use it as like a plan like C, D, or E, like very like break in case of glass emergency, break glass in case of emergency type thing. I mean, but licensing they don't like to hear, because it's kind of just like a lazy way to do it. Like you have this process and then you license it to somebody else that does the exact same thing that you do.
Yeah.
Which has like, then you're marginalizing your returns potentially. And when investors invest into a company, they want to be able to get anywhere from like 8 to 10x at the very least back of their investment.
Yeah.
So when they hear licensing, they're like, okay, it's not worth it.
But from your standpoint,
so
what do you think about licensing versus in-house?
No, I agree with it. I mean, like licensing is like a worst case scenario, to where like
you don't get
if we couldn't find a partner, if we're like out of, I don't know, I don't even want to go there. But the real money makers is doing it yourself. Like sourcing the shrimp shells yourself, doing the process yourself, selling the chitin yourself. That's where like you're going to get the type of returns like you're going to want if you're taking the risk to build a startup. So there's a bunch of different ways to like think about it. That's why I'm kind of like going off on tangents, but please just like
No, it's perfect.
because what I'm learning is
ahead.
like as we build this startup, like, and again, I mentioned my role is kind of like COO currently, and I think me specifically, like I'm the one that has like I have to understand every single aspect of it. So the business, the tech, the sales, the marketing, the distribution, etc. And I'm finding out now that all of these are very much so like intertwined with each other. I'll give you an example is we have to understand that typically people, when they purchase chitin, they're buying it in the kiloton scale. So enormous barrels, like the tankers you see like near MBS, like that level of quantity. And so we understand that in order, the capital investment needed from our side needed to build the infrastructure to where we can hit that quantity is going to be insanely high. And so we need to, in this short to medium term, we need to look at ways we can operate in a profitable model with lower quantity of sale. And so that's why, for example, I've really started to explore a lot of the chitin conversion technologies. Because like I said, if we can just take our chitin and then convert it into something else that has more value and people buy it on a much lower quantity, then that's how we can increase our margins and not need the amount of capital needed to build that enormous infrastructure. Also, what I said with like the byproducts, using those as a potential profit avenue is there as well. And again, to use the intertwining is this is all going to be dependent on what customers are looking for. So we can anticipate, we can convert our chitin into this, and this is more valuable, so people will buy it. But until you find an actual customer, like you don't have a product. Is the way I'm looking at it. Or like, for example, we could find out that, hey, like our technology, like the level of purity we're reaching, like we actually don't need to get that high of purity chitin. We can save some cost on these steps. Maybe produce it in either lower or larger amount depending on need, and then sell it to them there. So all of these things are very intertwined. I think we're at the point now where the customer discovery is going to be really important. Because I got one really good piece of advice, and you can kind of see like I'm struggling with this a bit because there are so many different potential uses for chitin, as I alluded to earlier. Was your mind like you can get excited on a lot of different things. But the advice I got was the only difference between a startup and a large, giant company is focus. We need to find something that like a business model in the short term that is very focused, where we have a very reliable and consistent customer base, and we can rely on that income. And then we can reinvest that into different avenues, whatever it be, whether it be building the larger infrastructure to make more chitin, whether it be, because I mentioned like the higher margin uses of chitin are like pharmaceuticals and cosmetics, but with these comes a much higher barrier of entry due to regulations and all the hurdles you have to jump into, especially if you're talking like pharmaceuticals. So this requires this is a very capital intensive process. Just going through all the litigation needed to like basically prove your product is good enough to use for these medicines. So that's kind of like the high level like thought process we're going now. We need to identify what we call like low hanging fruit. Like what in the short term can we like use and make money off of, and then concurrently as we're doing this, we're going to be looking up as well and seeing like what we can then reinvest this money into and have like those really strong returns once we get that infrastructure built out.
Sure. I think I can even feel the excitement when you talked about all these different potential areas of opportunities. But on my mind was always that one thing you mentioned earlier is this kind of loss in translation between what works in the lab scale to what works when you try to like scale it up, commercializing it from milligram to kilogram, that process. How do you know if a chemical reaction will work at a larger scale? Is it just a matter of outside factors, like do you have the right capital equipment, controlled environment, or does the reaction kind of change the chemistry formula?
It's actually more so like the chemistry of it changes quite a bit. Like there's a lot of things you have to consider from like an atomic to a molecular level. Things like heat and mass transfer, thermodynamic limitations, runoffs. Operating conditions can like naturally change. there's a lot of different possibilities. To answer your question, how do you know? You don't know until you do it. You don't know until you actually like start to run experiments and then identify. There's basically like we have, just like we did in the lab scale, there's ways to identify the problems in the reaction.
Yeah.
So basically the logic will be we scale it up, we just increase everything. If our numbers stay the same, great. We go to a higher scale.
Yeah.
If the numbers decrease, then we need to identify why and we need to address the issue or, come up with a solution. And this won't be my area of expertise. We have a CTO that will really focus on this. But I think it is important for me at least to know like what the issues are because I need to know whether or not we need to outsource additional expertise for it or if it falls in line with the expertise of our CTO. So, they call them experiments for a reason is you never know like what you're going to see. Even you kind of and I guess this could go to your earlier question of like what makes a good scientist is like a good scientist will never view an experiment as a failure. Even if, let's say, for example, we test our technology at a higher scale and we find out it doesn't work because of a certain reason, then that's not a failure. We're learning about what happens when you scale it up. And this is going to guide us to, I have confidence in our team that we'll be able to like address the technical issue. But this is kind of like the mindset you have to have. Like if something fails, it's like cliche, but like the Edison one is like, when he failed to, make the light bulb, he was finding ways it didn't work. And I do think that's one of the most important mindsets any scientist can have because especially during PhD, like you're going to fail a lot. I failed a lot and I know we're going to fail a lot during our startup. There's going to be a lot of issues that come up. But we just have to like, take it one step at a time, like fall back and leverage upon like the work we've put in, the reps we've put in, the problem solving that we've shown in the past, and work as a team to solve it. But yeah, you really don't know until you start to do the experiments. But all data is good data in my mind. Like you learn a lot by what doesn't work sometimes.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think as we come to the hour in the studio, we learned a lot about your background, your journey in science, also about this specific startup you're working on in your field of green chemistry. I kind of see this picture of at first you grew up in a more, I guess, business family household, your parents in the business side of the world, and you ventured into science, but now it's coming back in full circle. You're going back to the business side of on the chemistry.
Yeah, that's a great point. I haven't really thought about that, but
so
I always had an interest in, even when I was doing a PhD, an interest in industrializing technology. Yeah, like fundamental research. It is very interesting for like hardcore scientists, but I was always how can these processes make money? How can they actually improve what we do realistically? And I should have mentioned this, but our CEO is actually one of my best friends from Las Vegas, who is very business heavy. And I've learned a ton of business just chatting with him over the last month.
He's the lawyer you mentioned before that you brought on board.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, we talked off camera about him, but he's been super helpful. So in terms of building a startup, at this stage especially, the most important thing is building a strong team. Because until you have sales and until you're running in a profitable model, like investors, they're essentially investing in your idea and more importantly, the people too. So I'm super happy with how that's going so far. But that's one of the I mentioned we're doing this program at NUS with GRIP. That's like the advice that it really gets. A lot of the program actually is intended for finding team members. And I kind of already had all these ideas when I wanted to start. So I'm glad so far I'm getting everyone on my team I wanted. So
that's great. I think the people problem is always the most critical for a startup at the beginning stage.
For sure. A lot of startups fail because of like founder conflict or a lot of times what happens in deep tech is a scientist can oftentimes be like too married to their idea. Like they come up with this great idea in lab. And this was I've touched on it a few times is how important the market discovery is. And the reason for this is that a lot of scientists will create a problem that fits their solution because they want their idea to like really be a winner. But then you start to talk to people on the streets that actually do the job, and it's like, oh, okay, cool technology, but it doesn't actually address, the main market pain points. It's very important to find the issue first and then create a solution to address the issue. And it's super important to be able to like pivot as well, because what's an issue right now might not be an issue 5 years from now. And so that's why a lot of startups fail. That combined with especially science people can be very like raw on the business side of things. Even me, for example, like someone that's had interest in business, and I would say developed my skills in that regard more so than most scientists will during their PhD, just because my supervisor created my curriculum and like path for me according to my interest in that, which I'm super thankful for. But having like a business person that doesn't just have like the credentials, but also like the interest in the project and the relationship with the team is incredibly important. And I hear a lot of startups struggling because they don't have that guy. So I feel very thankful and lucky to have a great friend, and more importantly, like a damn good business person. With that. So, but the analogy I made with like the creating a problem to meet their solution, like that happens quite often. And that's why you literally need to like have boots on the ground, like be talking to people that actually do the stuff, like go visit these places, talk to these people like in person if you can.
Right.
All that's like super important.
Yeah. And I think the investors will also love to see that the leadership of the startup come from someone who have both the scientific background, also the business sense, like what you kind of acquired throughout your PhD journey and now. So perhaps now I pose to you the final question. Maybe I have some sense of what you will say already. It's if you look, forward to the rest of your career as a scientist or a business person from where we sit today, where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? Do you think you'll go back to fundamental research? Do you think you'll teach at the university, or do you think just keep going on this business path? On this niche field of within green chemistry.
I'm fully committed to developing this startup. I think you have to be, in order for it to be successful. I know our team is as well. So I absolutely see myself in terms of the timeline. So the short answer is I absolutely see myself like remaining a co-founder for this company. Our goal is by next year, like I said, to have strategic partnerships and things like that. We haven't mapped out the timeline. I would love to tell you what our goals for the company are within 4 to 5 years, because I think that would add some more specifics to my answer. We're not there yet. I can tell you by this time next year, we want to have a strategic partner in place where we're showing up to this enormous chemical plant and we're testing this thing on the large scale. And ideally, the strategic partner will be somebody that buys our material from us as well. Those are some of the best strategic partners. In terms of what we need investment-wise and additional co-founder-wise and capital-wise, like that will all depend kind of as we go through the process. As I kind of alluded to earlier, like we know with almost, I guess you can say like 90% certainty, because 90% of startups pivot from what their initial idea is into something different. So I can say almost with like complete certainty, like what our idea now will be completely different from a year from now in terms of like after we've done this customer discovery and we've gotten into the lab and see how things work on the large scale and explore other conversion technologies, like it's almost certainly going to change our pathway. So I think it would be disingenuous for me to tell you like specifically what I think the company will be doing in 5 years, because that would, I guess, communicate an unwillingness to pivot. And I am remaining incredibly flexible, but of course, I think if our company is still like moving and moving nicely by then, like I think that would be a great sign.
And I'll bring you back on the show for the series 2 of the startup journey. And
I would love to,
stay tuned.
Maybe chat again in a year or so, like once we've gone through this program and we've done this customer discovery and things like that, because a lot of this stuff is going to be completely new to me. You mentioned like as a scientist or a businessman, I do feel myself going more towards like the business side of things, which was kind of always my hope as well. Like I wanted to use my science to like as like a vehicle to get me to like where I wanted to go. And I feel like this kind of hybrid interest I have between business and science, like very much suits my role well. And I'm not like over leveraged in one way or another where I'm expected to be this hardcore scientist or this hardcore like Wall Street guy. I can kind of just leverage off of the two people in our team that are that and, you know, ensure communication, ensure day by day operations and efficiency and things like that are all things that I've shown to be more effective than, you know, just grinding in the lab for, you know, 80 plus hours a week. So, I think ideally in the next 5 years, like we'll have a company started and our team will be growing. We'll have employees. We'll have customers. We'll be in a couple, like not just customers in Singapore, but all throughout Southeast Asia. We want to have like some other co-founders. We want to bring in executive board members. All these things. Yeah,
cool. As a friend, I very much look forward to that. But with that note, I think we'll wrap up our conversation today. So a sincere thank you for Dr. Max to come on the show.
Of course, man. Thank you again for having me. I really had a lot of fun.